Imagine it. It's the turn of the 19th century. Railways are booming, industrialization is interconnecting the world, great markets are spurring. Imperialism is taking the world by storm. With great countries rising up, huge minority factions are being left behind. The concept of the minority has both troubled and frightened people for ages, whether it be blaming a small group for a large action or abusing their human rights. Minorities have historically been disenfranchised. It's ironic because every time a great oppressive movement occurs against one of these minority groups, it is justified through pseudo-scientific reasoning. The Negro brain is smaller than the white one. The Jews killed Jesus Christ. Mythological reasons like the one before prove dangerous for ideological movements as they give blanket justification to violence against minorities, which is almost inherent when creating these large fascist states. Looking at this concept from a purely 21st century lens, there is now an othering of Muslim Americans. The othering is done through the myth of Islamic terrorism, and this myth has created violence in America against these Muslim Americans, which has even led to a political agenda to ban Muslims. The sad part of it is that one of the Western world's most prized piece of literature cites itself as an original text for this concept. It is the Odyssey. As humanities students, we have all read the Odyssey through its Western tradition lens. It is known as an action-packed story with gods and goddesses and great sea plights. However, the Odyssey is an ancient prime example to the ignored oppressiveness through mythological reasoning. In a story like the Odyssey, it's easy to ignore Odysseus' marginalization of various groups on his journey home due to the text's exciting and thrilling narrative. However, it is much more noble to recognize the raging political narrative in this text, which is what this presentation will discuss. As a member of a minority faction myself, I can't help but look at the Odyssey from this political lens, as history has shown what happens when we don't look through this critical point of view. The extent to which the Odyssey justifies the building of these fascist states, therefore, is built on three main arguments: the roots of fascism, the political authority of the myth, and the cultural authority of violence. So, to begin, we must first note what exactly is fascism. Well, fascism is defined as an authoritarian, nationalistic, right-winged form of government. From this definition, one would assume it to be an extreme and evil danger to a proletariat class. However, in Jonathan Drucker's essay, The Shadowed Violence of Culture, Fascism and the Figure of Ulysses and Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, he makes a compelling argument about fascism and its connection to the Enlightenment. He defines fascism as a movement to bring forth enlightened ideas, which is quite contradictory to a 21st century view of fascism, as its negligence was known to not protect the proletariat class and not even bring forth equality. Jonathan Drucker elaborates even more on this concept, calling the Enlightenment as proletarian, even more calling the Enlightenment as a whole a myth, citing roots of the Enlightenment as a product of the thoughts of the bourgeoisie who viewed the world through matters of equivalence. Through this making of equivalent statements, the opinions of the world were brought to no more than abstract, uninterpretable ideas. Using this rationale, the Enlightenment becomes an illusion because there is no concrete answer to the problems people are trying to solve, only a mythological utopian ideals of the enlightened bourgeoisie. And this blurred reality is seen in almost every single fascist state ever. Hitler used the myth of the Aryan race to achieve a more equal environment, or so he believed. He told his people that his propaganda was helping them, and that he was solving the answer to Germany's problems. But there was no answer because there was no actual concrete process to get there. There was only myth. With the political narrative of the Odyssey being confounded on pure myth and seeing Odysseus as the sole answer to the people's problems, without his physical presence or concrete appearance, and the only hope being that he will one day return, he creates an illusion of self. One can easily understand how the Odyssey is actually a unique dystopian pre-Enlightenment novel, which transcends to its blurred authority in fascism. Thus, we redefine the Odyssey and redefine fascism. Now we must assert the political authority of the myth itself. Tony Stigliano makes another compelling argument about this authority seen in myth. In Stigliano's critique of myth, he asserts that myths are not only historical, but also transcendent in origin. Adding more, the transcendent nature of the myth makes it actually susceptible to social, economic, and political construct of countries. As it is more than the individual, represents the nation as a whole. In its word, it becomes a home. The Odyssey did this, as it gave the Greek people its very first religion, an identity to all agree on. The myth, therefore, is first comforting. Then it provides a home, then it provides identity and unites. Then it is used to justify the actions of various groups of people. The Greeks emulated this. When they wanted to progress and move forward, they united themselves under a language and a religion. It gave power to the Greeks, and they felt like as though they were the chosen ones. The myth, therefore, creates a propaganda tactic that, in turn, creates an othering in society, which best represents the nationalistic principles of fascist states. Nazism divided the Balkan states in the early 20th century, with separate groups feeling very strong convictions that they were the chosen ones, that they belonged in this land. The Odyssey, therefore, indirectly imposes this political agenda of the myth, as it was the first novel to give identity to the Greek state, and therefore created an othering of any other minority faction. Lastly, and very much so related to the political propaganda of the myth, is the cultural identity of violence seen in the Odyssey. Edith Hall, in her Odyssey of the Odyssey essay, says that, in fact, there is no distinction between what is cultural and what is political in the Odyssey, which makes for a very dangerous combination. As the cultural principles of violence and oppressions of other groups is done by Odysseus, he is justified in his actions, as he justifies other states' actions to do the same thing. The Greek god and goddess myth of Odysseus is just as important as the fight scenes and the political actions taken by Odysseus. Because of the cultural and political connection, the Greeks now believe that violence is the main way to uphold their country. Just think about it. How would the world have turned out if maybe Odysseus hadn't, killed Antinous and maybe used diplomatic relations? With each nationalistic regime having its own cultural identity, whether it be hate against another violent action, these cultural traits become warped into a political identity. Fascist regimes usually use very violent tactics to oust people against them, and the use of violent propaganda have been cited originally in the Odyssey. To answer the question as to what extent the Odyssey influenced the development of fascist states cannot be answered so simply, as the answer in fact blames the wrong group to why fascism has occurred. Mankind, and mankind only, is responsible for this development of such an evil power like of fascism. However, the principles of the Odyssey still have a lot to do with how fascism works. At the heart, the Odyssey is a mythological story that brought identity to the Grecian people. But the identity factor was so powerful that it gave justification to culture being tied with identity and othering of various groups. Fascist dictators did not consciously look to the Odyssey as a method to conquer and to form passionate cultural identity. However, the political narrative of the Odyssey rang with so many people across the world that its politics inspired people on how to build a powerful nation. The love Odysseus had for his nation and his noble climb to regain his throne justified all of his brutalization of ethnic groups. The argument of this question, therefore, comes to one simple fallacy in the way mankind views literature: the inability to separate truth from fiction. It's how you look at it. Are people good or are people bad? Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau would all have different things to say about such a concept. However, in the end, the Odyssey is only a myth, a child's story, and it being a foundational text in literature, mankind took it and ran with it as if it was their guidebook for life, which led to much more obvious destruction later on in life. So, ultimately, you are the decider on how you decide to interpret literature. Yes, the Odyssey has a raging political narrative that most definitely sees strings in fascist states. However, whether you choose to put man as the middle person in that whole factor, or whether you choose to put the literature itself, is up to you. Thank you.